Hi, this is Ken McCarthy from Jazz on the Tube, and given current events, I'd like to read an article to you. It's called "The Anti-Nazi Teen Gang That Beat Up Hitler Youth and Danced to Jazz." And I'm going to read it to you right now. It's a little historical note. A band of adolescent music lovers, swing dancers, and snappy dressers, not exactly the type you'd expect to take on Nazi Hitler Youth, but in pre-World War II Germany, the Nazi regimentation of society inadvertently gave rise to massive teenage street gangs who beat up the Hitler Youth, tagged anti-Nazi graffiti at train stations, and listened to jazz. Aged 12 to 17, these non-conforming youths were usually referred to as Edelweiss pirates by the Gestapo. They were considered an anti-authoritarian subculture of kids rebelling against the system, in this case, the Nazi regime. When membership of the Hitler Youth became mandatory in 1936, thousands of youths, particularly from Cologne and of working-class families, wanted no part in it. The strict paramilitary and gender-segregated organization didn't exactly fit with their teenage lifestyle of hanging out on street corners, listening to jazz and swing music, and flirting with the opposite sex. Jazz music was considered, quote, degenerate music, unquote, by Nazi ideology because it was often performed by black and Jewish musicians. Unauthorized, quote, off-grid travel away from Nazi eyes was also strictly illegal at the time in Germany, so they did just that, organizing secret camping trips away in the mountains, hiding out in forests where they could listen to the band music, sing songs, hang out with the opposite sex, and generally break the rules while enjoying a free life without alarms and air raids. In the city of Essen, another gang adopted the name Fartenstenser, which in English means the traveling dudes. One subgroup, called the Navajos from Cologne, wrote a song that went like this: Hitler's dictates make us small, we're yet bound in chains, but one day we'll again walk tall. No chain can restrain. For hard are our fists, yes, knives at our wrists, for youth to be free. Navajos lay siege. There were also the Swing Kids, a group of high school upper-class students who admired the British and American way of life. They danced in private quarters, clubs, rented halls, accessorizing their looks with British and American flair. Boys wore Union Jack pins on their jackets, and girls wore short skirts, lipstick, and kept their hair long instead of in Nazi-style braids. But when the Nazi Party came into power, their pastime became a political statement. So while the Edelweiss pirates wanted to rebel, the traveling dudes wanted adventure, and the swing kids just wanted to dance, they all shared the common name to avoid complete subordination to the Hitler Youth and establish their own youth identity. A file compiled by the Gestapo is said to have contained more than 3,000 names already by the 1930s in Cologne alone. In terms of numbers, that would mean these youths represented a much larger resistance potential than any other opposition group in Germany made up by adults. They became bolder in number, tagging public walls with anti-Nazi slogans like "Down with Hitler" and "Medals for Murder," throwing bricks through windows and sabotaging cars of Nazi officials, escalated to raiding military bases, derailing trains, and even planning to blow up the Gestapo headquarters in Cologne. They sound like they were resistance fighters, but the majority of Edelweiss pirates did not see themselves as such and were merely fighting to claim a bit of self-determination and freedom. Of course, both the Hitler Youth and Gestapo went after them. At first, it was just the patrols of Hitler Youth that would often raid camping trips or secret dances. In turn, the pirates ambushed their patrols and took great pride in beating them up. One of their slogans was "Eternal War on the Hitler Youth." But the persecution of these groups, kids, became increasingly violent when the Gestapo got involved. One of the leaders of the Navajos, Jean Jurlich, was tortured for 4 months. He was 15. Another 16-year-old ringleader was executed by hanging in public. It goes without saying that he had no trial. But after World War II and the Soviets moved in, the anti-authoritarian youth groups, now older and hardened by war, found no peace. If they hadn't allowed the Nazis to tell them what to do, they certainly weren't going to let the Russians. They clashed with the New Order in the Soviet zones, where they would be thrown in prison for a 25-year sentence if caught by the communists. The pirates had always turned their backs on politics or any environment where politics took central stage. This forced them into the role of social outcasts and out of the history books where their stories should have been told. Until 2005, they were considered a criminal organization. It wasn't until recently that these kids who took on Hitler and the most evil regime to rise in modern history were officially recognized as resistance fighters, even though they would probably have preferred the title Rebel Knights of Badassery or something along those lines. If you're interested in a movie recommendation, there's a great movie about this called Swing Kids. Wow. And jazz was part of their life. We recently did an interview with a jazz musician who came from Eastern Europe. He came from Bulgaria, and his name was Mishlo Leviev. And he talked about what jazz musicians had to go through during the Soviet regime. And you can hear him tell the story on the interview, but for you to hear it now, because it's relevant, jazz wasn't officially outlawed in the Eastern Bloc during the Soviet times, but it was frowned upon, which means if you were a professional musician with professional aspirations and you were too public about your jazz playing in this state-controlled society of the Eastern Bloc, you could count on a really truncated career. So jazz was learned and practiced and rehearsed and performed mostly privately. And obviously there was no jazz education programs in Eastern Europe. And the way people learned, the way the musicians learned, according to Milcho, was through Voice of America, which was broadcast at 1 a.m. And the Bulgarians, as all the Eastern Bloc countries did, made their best effort to jam it. In other words, to interfere with the radio signal so no one could hear it. So the serious jazz people in Bulgaria would all be up at 1 with their primitive makeshift tape recorders, and everybody would try to record it, and he who got the best recording would share it with everybody else. They would then take those recordings and do their best to transcribe them and learn from them. And that was the state of jazz education in Eastern Europe in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and I'm sure 80s too, and beyond. So why did Milcho love jazz so much? He said very simply because it represented freedom. So something for us jazz fans to consider during these times that we're in right now.